After pleading with God that he be allowed to live again, God gives him a second chance. George is now a changed man. He dances to the street as we saw, and everything is wonderful. The bloody lip is wonderful. The building and loans is wonderful. The drafty old house, which he used to be disgusted with, is now wonderful. Even the prospect of going to jail is wonderful. The kids who were underfoot and irritating when he was fixated on financial ruin are now a welcome sight. You see, George's perspective on life had all changed. It's no accident that joy is here associated with the intervention of heaven. It isn't until we realize how messed up we are and we cry out to God to live again are we then able to discover a wonderful, abundant life. And that's a reason why Jesus came, as we see in John chapter 10, verse 10. Now, we're taking a break from our study in the book of Ephesians to focus this Christmas season on why Jesus came. And there are several occasions in the gospel, I count at least 7, in which a specific reason is given for Jesus' coming. Often they're words right from Jesus' lips, and he says, "This is why I came. This is why I came." Well, we're going to look at least 3 of those and perhaps a 4th one on the Sunday before Christmas. And we begin our series by looking at the Gospel of John chapter 10. And I invite you to turn your Bibles to John chapter 10. John chapter 10. Now, my purpose this morning is not to do an exhaustive study on the shepherd and sheep relationship, though the picture here is indeed marvelously rich. But my purpose is to open our eyes to the imagery here as it relates to an abundant living. Now, the main thought is this. Christ came that we might experience life the way it was meant to be. Christ came that we might experience life the way it was meant to be. And you see, the human heart wants so much more than just safety. We want so much more than mere life. We want abundant life, overflowing life, deep life, joyful life. We don't just really want to survive. We want to thrive. We were made for this, and Jesus says that's why he came. And Jesus looks at us and he says, "Let me make something out of your life. Let me make something out of your life." Well, it's in the 10th verse of John chapter 10 that Jesus states a reason that he came. It's an outrageous claim. Jesus says, the end of verse 10, "I have come that they may have life," and not just average life, but life to the full. Life abundant. Life to overflowing. And what is interesting about John chapter 10 is what we often don't quote. It's the first half of verse 10. Jesus says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy." Then Jesus adds, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." So our outline for this morning, before we look at the trusted voice of the shepherd and that he's the only door to soul satisfaction, is first I want us to look at joy robbers. Joy robbers, and then the trusted voice of the shepherd, and then the only door to soul satisfaction. First, let's look at joy robbers. Now, it's helpful to our understanding of John chapter 10 and John 10:10 to realize that the entire chapter of John 10 is about contrasts. The contrast really is set up for us back in chapter 9. And so in order to get the full sense of the use of contrast of John 10, we must see the context of these verses here, John 10:10. We need to see the context of it. So I need to reach back a little bit to John chapter 9. Now, I don't know if you recall, but in John chapter 9, it's the true account of the man born blind who was given sight. You recall that Jesus called the blind man to himself, and he made a worshiper out of him. We don't want to miss this. The summit of abundant life is the worship of Christ. That's the peak of it all, is the worship of Christ. It goes back to him. Now, this man in chapter 9 is absolutely ecstatic. Why wouldn't he be? He was once blind and now he can see. And if we were to read chapter 9 in its entirety, we would see how hard the Pharisees were on this man who was once blind but can now see. The Pharisees were heartless. They were not caring about this man one bit. They are the proverbial skunk at the lawn party. And what should be cause for joy that this man, once blind, can now see, this downer of the group, the Pharisees come along and take all the wind, or at least try to take all the wind out of this man's sail. And chapter 9 closes with Jesus speaking to the Pharisees of a worse condition than physical blindness. You know what it is? Spiritual blindness. So the contrast is set up for us between the spiritually blind Pharisees, the false shepherds who didn't care anything about the sheep, and the true shepherd who cares and loves the sheep. And so with that in mind, I want us to read verse 41 of John 9 and go right into chapter 10, verse 1. 9:41, Jesus says to the spiritually blind Pharisees, he says, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. So the only thing worse than spiritual blindness is thinking that you can see. And he's saying you can't see at all. Your guilt remains. Now remember, there are no chapter breaks in the original, so the thought of verse 41 continues right into verse 1 of chapter 10. And Jesus says there, 10:1, I tell you the truth, or verily, verily, I say unto you, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. Now it is unmistakable here. The Pharisees are the thieves and the robbers. They are the stranger spoken of in chapter 10, verse 5. The thieves, the robbers, the strangers are hirelings. They care nothing for the sheep. They only care about themselves. They could care less about this man who was born blind. They tried to rob this man of his newfound joy. You see, that's what Pharisees do. That's what legalists do. They try and take the joy right away from you. A little girl was visiting with her grandmother in the country, and things were going fine in her visit until Sunday. She went to church with Graham, and the preacher got up, and he began to speak about the importance of keeping the Sabbath by forbidding all work, and you're not supposed to have fun or lightheartedness or laughing and playing. The little girl then went home from church and began playing with her dolls and laughing as little girls do. Her grandmother rebuked her and reminded her that what the preacher had said, and said, you need to quiet down. You're not supposed to be having fun. The little girl then left the house and she went out for a walk to the barn. She went over in the barn and she saw this old mule, a droopy-eyed, sad-faced, long-eared mule. She looked at the mule for a minute and then said, Mr. Mule, you look like you go to my grandmother's church. Jesus said, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And we think system rather than Savior. Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. We think rules instead of relationship. And so following Christ then becomes a burden, not a blessing. As I landed on my title for this week, It's a Wonderful Life, it isn't meant to be sarcastic. You know, it is a wonderful life. I mean, in some days I felt like that, I'll be honest. Yeah, it's a wonderful life, isn't it? No. It's a wonderful life. It is. Not in the sense that everything's hunky-dory and free of stress and challenge, but wonderful in deeper, more satisfying ways. Christ tells us He came to give us life and life to the full. Let's think about what that means. I mean, is that really what we all want? Aren't we really looking for substance and satisfaction and meaning and purpose and a quality of life that strips away all the complexities to experiencing the liberating joy of simplifying our lives? I am convinced, as I think about joy robbers, I am convinced that one of the reasons we do not know this abundant life is because we have complicated Christianity. We have complicated Christianity. We have been led to believe that if we can relate well to the structures in place, we are doing well in our faith. So we cross our ritual T's, we dot our religious I's, and we call it Christianity. But have you noticed any Mr. and Mrs. Mules around? Right? They go through life joyless. Oh, I'm just hanging on. I just can't wait to get to heaven. Their faith is nothing more than this dreadful, dutiful obligation to fulfill. I don't want that. I don't want that for you. Because Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. I ask you, does that describe your relationship with Christ lately? What's robbing you of experiencing the fullness of life Christ wants you to have? I mean, has Christianity become this host of rituals? Has it become a philosophy of life? Has it become simply the best choice among other possible lifestyles? Has it become a Sunday thing? Thieves and robbers attempt to steal away your joy. That is Satan's agenda. If they can get you to complicate your faith, then before long your Christian life consists of codes and systems rather than following the compelling Christ. So in contrast to these joy robbers, these thieves, these bogus shepherds, Jesus doesn't give this word picture of a true shepherd and how a true shepherd relates to his sheep. And so we look at the trusted voice of the shepherd. The trusted voice of the shepherd. I pick it up in verse 2 of John 10. Jesus says, the man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they'll never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Now, the picture here, as best as I can tell, is that in Palestine, at that time, there was in each village a common sheepfold. And all the shepherds in that village at night would lead their sheep into that communal sheepfold. Bunch of sheep were there, not just your own. That's where you'd keep them for the night. The shepherd would make sure that each of his own sheep made it into the sheepfold for the night. He would even examine them to make sure they were not injured or sickly in any way because he knew his sheep. He knew his sheep very well. The shepherd even had names given to each of his sheep, likely by some particular characteristic, like brown leg or black ear or long nose or fluffy. I don't know. I wonder what his name is for me. Maybe it's Itchy as of late. I don't know. Well, then the shepherds, they put him in this communal sheepfold, and then they would retire for the night, and a gatekeeper, a watchman, was hired to care for the sheepfold during the night in the shepherd's absence. Then in the morning, the shepherd would come back, and he would stand at the entrance to the sheepfold, and he would call out his sheep by name. How beautiful is that? By name. Isn't that the way of Jesus? Zacchaeus, Lazarus, Mary, Simon, Matthew. Jesus the shepherd loves, owns, and knows the sheep. He knows your name. He knows every wound. He knows every heartache. He knows every illness. He knows every concern. He knows every one of your needs. Jesus, the true shepherd, he walks in front of you as he leads you, and he sees the danger before you see it. Every place you as his sheep go, he has already been. Whatever you've gone through or you're about to go through, he's been there. I don't know about you. I needed to hear that this week. He knows us intimately, and we follow him because we trust his voice. That's how it should be. That's life the way God wanted it to be for us. It would be abnormal for sheep to follow any other voice but their own shepherds. I ask you, church, do you recognize his voice? Do you recognize his voice? As many of you know, for years I coached basketball, and during the game, I would often call out some play from the sidelines, or I'd give some quick verbal instruction, or I'd give some reminder to my players while they're out on the court playing. You know what I discovered as I was barking out some instruction? That there were several other coaches giving out instructions during the game. These coaches, they sat in the stands. They'd yell out, "Shoot! Slow down! Pass it!" And I know none of you parents do any of this, right? I know you don't. I think when I sit in the stands, I do the same thing. But I realized at that moment that there were many other voices that competed with my voice. I realized how many people knew the game of basketball and felt free to coach it from the stands. So in pregame speeches and in timeouts, I would often remind my high school players, listen, guys, listen to my voice. Tune into hearing me. And when you go home, you got to listen to them. But for now, you tune into me. You hear my voice. You know, in the same way, there are many voices competing with his voice. There are trendy voices. There are voices from entertainment. There are voices from our peers. There's media voices. There's voices of how we have always done it. There's voices to play it safe. There are voices that shame us. There are voices that defeat us. There are voices that lure us into this myth of the greener grass where we have no business going because it's outside of God's will and into danger zone, and yet a voice calls us there. You see, there are those who are out to steal, kill, and destroy. There are even those who dress like shepherds, who tell you lots of wonderful stories, promise you all kinds of amazing perks to being a Christian, and who care more about themselves than the flock. They're out there. And mindlessly and desperately, people follow them to their own ruin and experience frustration that threatens their joyful existence. We do not have to wander here and there to that book and to that teaching, to that experience, for there's only one voice worth following. Jesus says simply, his sheep follow him because they know his voice. And Jesus is obviously identifying himself as that trusted voice. He says it again in chapter 10, verse 27, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." His is a trusted voice. Can you distinguish his voice from others? Christ came to free us from the joylessness of following other seductive voices, to experiencing life that was meant to be. And listen, if we're never picking this up, you're not going to be able to distinguish his voice. You're not. I don't care how long you've walked with Christ. Listen to the trusted voice of the shepherd who knows us, cares about us, and will lead us to that place of abundant living. That is why he came. And then in a slight of change of a metaphor, Jesus goes from the trusted voice of the shepherd to the only door to soul satisfaction. The only door to soul satisfaction. I pick it up in verse 7. Follow along. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All whoever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. Now, notice here, Jesus calls himself the gate or the door in some translations. This is a new picture, by the way, of the sheep pen. It wasn't the communal sheepfold that Jesus just talked about. This is different. This was an enclosed pen with a single opening through which the sheep would enter in and exit out. And there would be times that late at night they wouldn't make it to the communal sheepfold, and so the shepherd and the sheep were too far from that in the village, so instead of traveling back to the village, the shepherd would build a little sheepfold on the hillside just for his own sheep. This temporary sheepfold would be a simple wall made of mud or wood with a little opening in it. There was no door per se, an opening. Now, here's what the shepherd would do. This is my understanding of it. Here's what the shepherd would do. After taking care of his sheep and getting them into the fold, he would then lie down across the opening of the sheepfold. He'd lie down in that opening, and the sheep couldn't go out or in without passing over the shepherd's body. He literally became the door. Now, I just need to point something out here because it's just been twisted. But in verse 9, it says sheep going in and going out. Some have wrongly taught that it's referring to people going in and out of salvation. Bogus. That goes against Jesus' own words in this chapter and his security for his sheep. In verse 28 of chapter 10, Jesus says, I gave them eternal life. They shall never perish. No one can snatch them out of my hands. Listen, you can't jump out either. It's got you. Kick it out. And so in speaking of going in and going out through the door to find pasture, it's language of satisfaction. The true shepherd not only takes care of us, but he feeds us. What is our pasture? What is our food that he takes us out to? It's right here. The Word of God. This is our food. This is our pasture. You show me a weak and feeble sheep, and I'll show you a sheep that's not eating. You show me a healthy sheep, and I'll show you one that's feeding on the Word to their soul. Church, are we feasting on the Word of God? You trying to have abundant life without it? You're kidding yourself. Christ is the only door to soul-satisfying pastures. Are you finding that joy in Him? Or are you looking other places for that satisfaction? We kind of go all over the place for it. There was a Wimbledon tennis champion that all his life he thought that if he just won this one tournament, this major tournament, that his life, as he knew it, would finally bring his greatest fulfillment. He just needed to win that one tournament. Well, he won that championship, and he said, well, the thrill of victory lasts about 15 minutes. Actor Jim Carrey once said, I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer. He's no scholar. He spoke truth. See, the answer's not found in any of that. It's not even found in a nice social cause, as nice as that is. Bob Geldof was a British rock musician who decided to do something about the famine in Ethiopia during I think it was early 80s. He put his own career on the back burner and spent an entire year of his life organizing fundraising events for dozens of famine relief organizations. He was the inspiration behind the song We Are the World and the Live Aid event. His efforts helped raise more than $1 million. It was in the millions toward famine relief. Well, after that year was over and he got all this money, he donated all this money, he wrote a book that summarized his experience. The book is called, Is That It? Is That It? Geldof recognized that even though those accomplishments were significant, he couldn't escape this feeling of fulfillment. They didn't have it. He knew he was lacking it. For more than a year, the famine in Ethiopia had been his reason for living. And after all he had accomplished, he realized that hardly a dent had been made in the problem of world hunger, and his efforts hadn't brought him any peace of mind that he had hoped for. Now listen, the point isn't disregard the needy or dismiss all social efforts. That's not the point. We shouldn't diminish what he did. The point is, not even good humanitarian performance fills up the soul. Doesn't do it. It's found in a person. See, no matter how lofty your goals, if Jesus isn't the reason for your living, you won't find fulfillment, no matter how good it is. Christ came to give us his life, and life to overflowing. He lays down his life for the sheep. Do you know him? There once was a Shakespearean actor who was known everywhere for his one-man show of readings and recitations from the classics. And he would always end his performance with a dramatic reading of Psalm 23. Each night, without exception, as the actor began his recitation, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The crowd would listen attentively. And then at the conclusion of the psalm, they would rise in thunderous applause and appreciation of the actor's incredible ability to bring the verse to life. But one night, just before the actor was to offer his customary recital of Psalm 23, a young man from the audience spoke up and he said, "Sir, do you mind if tonight I recite Psalm 23? The actor was quite taken aback by this unusual request, but he allowed the young man to come forward and stand front and center of the stage to recite Psalm 23, knowing that the ability of this unskilled youth would be no match to his own talent. And with a soft voice, the young man began to recite the words of the psalm. And when he was finished, there was no applause. There was no standing ovation as other nights. All that could be heard was the sound of weeping. The audience had been so moved by the young man's recitation that every eye was full of tears. Amazed by what he heard, the actor said to the youth, "I don't get it. I've been performing Psalm 23 for years. I have a lifetime of experience in arts and training, but I've never been able to move an audience as you have tonight. Tell me, young man, what is your secret?" The young man humbly replied, "Well, sir, you know the psalm. I know the shepherd." Do you know the shepherd? I'm not asking you, do you know about the shepherd? I'm not asking you, do you know this verse or that verse? Do you know the shepherd? Do you know the shepherd's voice? Are you part of his fold? And if not, maybe you're starting to feel his prodding this morning. Maybe he's calling out your name. Will you hear it and enter the sheepfold of the true shepherd? Because all the other voices call you away from him. All these other voices lead you to death-like existence, to a place of destruction and despair. And then I ask you, do you want to live again? Don't you long to see again what is wonderful? Jesus came to give us abundant life. We cannot know this abundant life from other than by embracing the truth of reconciliation. That he is the one, Christ was the one who was born to die and bring reconciliation between God and sinners. There's no other way there. Do you know him? Do you know him? Would you like to? I invite you then following the service, talk to me about it. Talk to Pastor Dan. I'll hook you up with one of the elders or a woman in the church. Just don't leave here if you know God's pulling you in that direction. Settle that. Settle that. You may be here this morning and say, well, I'm already a sheep. And I ask you this, are you a healthy one? Are you feeding in green pastures? Do you hear his voice? Are you following his voice? Are you living out an abundant life? Is your joy overflowing? Christ said, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. You see, Jesus came not only to give us a quantity of life on the other side, but a quality of life here of which nothing else compares. And sadly, I'm afraid that at times we resign ourselves to accepting only this mediocre, average life here as we wait for the real joy and satisfaction on the other side. That's only partially true. Because what awaits us, yes, is indeed greater and more stupendous than anything we can find here. That is true. But isn't there to be a quality of life to be enjoyed here because we know the shepherd? I think so. I mean, shouldn't we be the ones who run through the streets joyfully greeting everyone we meet? Merry Christmas! Wonderful savings and loans. Oh, you're great. Why? Because we were once blind, but now we see. Why? Because we found new life, a second chance, a vision of what Christ intends for our lives to become. Because at that very moment, we desperately cry out to him, I want to live again no matter where you are in your life. We can experience life the way it was meant to be. He will lead us again and again and again to pasture, to life, to abundant life. It's a wonderful, abundant life. Jesus said that is why he came. Followers of Christ experience life the way it was meant to be. He promises a life to overflowing. Don't you long just to live again? I don't know what you're going through. Maybe it's just time to cry out to him and say, I want to live again. I want to live in this abundant life. Tim Hansel tells a story of an 82-year-old man who had served as pastor for 52 years. He was now struggling with skin cancer. He already had 15 operations. And besides suffering from the pain, he was so embarrassed about how he looked, he would not even go out of the house. He was starting to drown in self-pity. He had no reason to live in his eyes. One day as he was reading in a book, You Gotta Keep Dancing, the author there gave a personal testimony of a day he made a pivotal decision to respond to his own physical hardship by choosing joy. Well, this pastor, as he was reading that, he slammed the book down thinking, he's crazy. I can't choose joy. One day, he read John 15:11, where Jesus says, I want to give you my joy so that your joy may be complete. And he was broken. He got on his face before the Lord, and he said, Lord, give me this joy. Turn it on, Lord. Turn it on. I need it. Before he knew it, he said he was dancing around the house. He said, I felt born again. And at 82, he was a changed man. He then went out to a local fast food place, and the lady saw this happiness and glow on his face, and she asked, how you doing? He said, I am wonderful. Oh, is it your birthday? She asked. Oh, no, no, honey, it's much better than that. Your anniversary? No, 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 better than that, he said. Well, what is it? She asked excitedly. And he answered, it's the joy of Jesus Christ. Do you know what I'm talking about? He asked her. Do you know what I'm talking about? The lady shrugged and replied, oh, no, I have to work on Sundays. Now think about this. Tim Hansel then says, isn't that the way it is? We have limited the idea of an exciting Christianity to one day of the week. I'm sorry, I have to work on Sundays. Jesus said, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And so we come to worship on Sunday and we think this is it. Are you experiencing all that God has for you? It's found in an encounter with the living Christ. You know, this time of year, there's decorations and there's music, and it's all going to get us into the holiday spirit. I get that. We might go see Nutcracker or a Christmas Carol or community Christmas tree lighting. I don't know what it does I don't know what it is for you. That's all good. That's fine. But you know what? There's more than that. Are you experiencing life the way it was meant to be? Being filled with nostalgia doesn't go far enough. Being filled with the joy of his presence can be a day-to-day reality. I ask you this question as we end. What are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? To live again. It's been said this way, the tragedy of life is not that it ends so soon, but that we wait so long to begin it. Let's pray.